I'm Ricky Miyoshi from the University of Oxford, presenting the paper Thomas Killigrew as Theatre Manager, Carolean Stage Rivalry in London, 1663 to 1668. The competition between two patent acting troupes, the King's Company and the Duke's Company, and their respective managers Thomas Killigrew and Sir William Davenant, had an enormous influence on the types of plays produced during the Carolean period. Yet, as Robert D. Hume recently noted, although a comprehensive theatre history of the rivalry between the troupes is foundational, it has never yet been seriously told. This paper therefore undertakes a survey of the early Carolean theatrical competition from 1663 to 1668. Until 1663, both troupes were busy consolidating their duopoly, and the death of Davenant in 1668 put a stop to the competition and concluded the period of rivalry between the two managers. Through a comprehensive survey of the competition, this paper moreover revises the reputation of Thomas Killigrew, the manager of the King's Company. Killigrew's reputation partly suffered from the contemporary accounts that dealt with his scandalous personality. Killigrew drew the scorn of wits such as John Denham, who wrote, "Had Cowley never spoke, Killigrew never writ. Combined in one, they made a matchless wit." Killigrew's infamous character possibly prompted such insults as that in the Secession of the Poets, where the 10th stanza condemns his vanity for having Apollo refuse him the laurel. Thomas Killigrew boldly came up to the bar, thinking his gibings would get him the bays, but Apollo was angry and bid him beware that he caught him no more printing his plays. Samuel Pepys, the diarist, having dined with Killigrew on 30th of July 1667, complained, "I never heard so much vanity from a man in my life. So, being now wary of him, we parted." John Wilmot, 2nd Earl of Rochester, was once so offended by the mirth and raillery of the playhouse manager that he did give Tom Killigrew a box on the ear in the King's presence. Indeed, Killigrew, who held the title of the King's Fool or Jester, had the sole privilege of being allowed to revile or jeer anybody, even the greatest person, without offence. This privilege even extended to freely affronting the king, as Killigrew is once quoted abusing Charles II to his face as the one who spends his time in employing his lips and his prick about the court and has no other employment. Richard Flecknoe, a playwright, berated the king's patentee in his work Life of Tomaso the Wanderer, an attack upon Thomas Killigrew, as an unprincipled cad who cared not in whose light he stood, so he might see. Indeed, according to the same playwright, Killigrew was born to discredit all the professions he was, the traveller, courtier, soldier, writer, and the buffoon. Modern critics have not strayed far from Flecknoe's judgment, as Killigrew's personal ignominy seemed to have spilled over into his professional reputation. Unlike Sir William Davenant, his early career counterpart and competitor at the Duke's Company, Killigrew's reputation as a manager has suffered from indifference. The only full-length monograph on Thomas Killigrew has been by Alfred Harbidge, almost half a century ago. Critically, however, Harbidge's study does not consider Killigrew's career as theatre manager. Theatre historians such as Arthur Nethercott and Mary Edmund have preferred to solely concentrate on the achievements of the Duke's Company's manager, William Davenant, instead. On the rare occasions when critics passingly refer to Killigrew's managerial career, they are mostly dismissive. Peter Thomson contrasted the two managers by characterizing Killigrew as an amateur and Davenant a professional. Derek Hughes has summed up Killigrew's managerial career as fulfilling the role of doodling amateur. Judith Milhouse wrote that Thomas Killigrew's managerial career serves as an objective lesson in how not to operate a theatre company. In the process, Killigrew has gradually faded into obscurity. This paper, therefore, for the first time undertakes a comprehensive survey of the competition from 1663 to 1668, and at the same time reconsiders the prevalent argument that Thomas Killigrew was an incompetent manager. For William Davenant, the theatrical season of 1663 began with a crisis. Samuel Pepys reported on 22nd of July that Henry Harris, a player, had apparently grown very proud and demanded more money than anybody else. Davenant staunchly refused this request, which, with other things, Sir William Davenant would not give him. Undoubtedly the rebuff stung the actor's pride, as he responded by swearing that he would never act there any more in expectation of being received in the other house. Indeed, rumour had it that Harris was receiving a stipend from the King's house privately. Thomas Killigrew was most likely behind the scenes instigating the disturbance. No doubt his former employment as a spymaster served him well in finding dissidents within the rival company and influencing them to defect. It is instructive to see why he chose to tempt Harris and not Thomas Betterton. It was, after all, Harris who was on everyone's lips, with the King and everybody else crying him up so high. Harris was also an accomplished singer and painter. When Winifred Gosnell, for example, fell out of the key so that the music could not play to her afterwards, and so did Harris also go out of the tune to agree with her. And as spectacular scenery was becoming increasingly important, he possessed an indispensable expertise as a painter, the position, incidentally, he was originally hired to fill. Killigrew must have known that by enticing Harris, he would severely handicap the Duke's company's chances of success, even to the point of forcing Davenant to shut up the house. Indeed, Davenant was only saved from his own stubbornness by his patron, the Duke of York, who had enough sense to intervene and persuade Harris to come again to Sir William Davenant upon his terms that he demanded, which will make him very high and proud. Davenant's production of Shakespeare's Henry VIII, soon after Harris's return, served as a direct challenge to Killigrew and his company. By the personal order of Sir William Davenant, the play was all new, clothed in proper habits, with new scenes. Not only were there new costumes and scenery, but also the play was well rehearsed. For his part in particular, Betterton was instructed in it by Sir William, who had it from old Mr. Lowen. It was perceptive of John Downes, the prompter of the Duke's company, to stress how Davenant had consciously taught Betterton in the style of John Lowen, a preeminent actor of the old King's Men. For this was a deliberate effort on the part of Davenant to compete with the superior acting style of Killigrew's players, who carried on the antebellum traditions of performance. Killigrew immediately responded to Davenant's production by mounting the Indian Queen. The play was written as a collaboration between Sir Robert Howard and his brother-in-law John Dryden. Killigrew's eagerness to outdo Davenant can be seen in that he not only employed his best playwrights, but also in January 1664, a warrant to the Master of the Great Wardrobe was issued to deliver to Thomas Killigrew, Esquire, to the value of £40 in silks. His aim was not only to match Davenant's challenge, but also to surpass his production both in substance and pomp. Killigrew's strategy evidently worked. Pepys observed the street full of coaches outside of the playhouse as word of mouth circulated that it exceeds Henry VIII. John Evelyn praised it as well written and so beautified with rich scenes as the like had never been seen on a mercenary theatre. The success of the Indian Queen was such that even after George Etheridge's premiere of the comical Revenge, Pepys still recorded the Duke's house was very empty by reason of a new play at the other house. Davenant's creativity was seriously strained as he competed against Killigrew. Most likely, the financial constraints forced him to reuse old costumes in Pompey the Great as they acted in English habits, so that Caesar was hissed off the stage. Charles II complained in a letter, "I am just now come from seeing a new ill play." Davenant's own The Unfortunate Lovers was not received any better, as according to Pepys, I was not much pleased with it. Learning from his Pompey experience, Davenant was careful to equip his actors with authentic clothing in an adaptation of Pierre Corneille's Heraclius. But to the great consternation of the translator, Lodowick Carlyle, the play was rejected that very day it appeared on stage. Astonishingly, Davenant, by putting an abrupt stop to the production, had squandered the company funds for just one performance. It is possible that he was betting on the success of his next production, The German Princess. The play centers on the real-life tribulations of the impostor Mary Moders, who, after being indicted for bigamy, leaves for the continent and comes back to London posing as a German princess. She is once more charged with bigamy and dragged to the Old Bailey for trial. The court case and her subsequent victory caused a sensation among the London public. Davenant attempted to cash in on the sensation by casting Mary Moders as herself in The German Princess, but his idea backfired to the embarrassment of the company. Pepys, who saw the performance on 15th of April 1664, wrote, "Although the play was acted by the woman herself, there never was anything so worse performed." In any event, by the time Davenant tried to capitalize on the scandal, it seemed to have been too late, as the play did not run a second night and did not make it into print. For Davenant to rely on such short-term strategy indicates that he was becoming increasingly desperate. While the Duke's players, led by Davenant, were frantically experimenting with new plays to combat their rival, the King's Company mostly mounted pre-Restoration drama. The stock plays were reliable assets as they brought steady profit and also took less time to prepare. Indeed, most complaints about under-rehearsed performances were made about new plays. It is a case in point that Pepys complained of the Duke's players in July 1664 when he noted, for want of practice, many of them forgot their parts. No such comments were made about the King's Company during this time. On 2nd of August 1664, however, Killigrew's company was jolted out of its complacency when Walter Clun, a King's player, was set upon and murdered, which deprived the company of one of their best actors. To make matters worse, the King's players complained to the Lord Chamberlain that Killigrew had taken possession of Clun's dead share. This was not the first time a dead share had caused trouble in the company, and it is important to see this incident within a larger context. Over a year before, another player, Theophilus de Burgh, had died. It appears that during this time Killigrew had appointed the leading players Charles Hart, Michael Mohun, and John Lacey to direct the company. The three players accordingly divided Bird's dead share amongst themselves. The rest of the company saw this as a fraudulent maneuver and protested to Killigrew, who immediately withdrew delegated authority of the triumvirate and returned the dead share back to the company. Leslie Hodson concluded from the two cases that, first of all, Killigrew was an absentee manager as he failed for a time to direct the company, and secondly implied that Killigrew, as the irresponsible patentee, was the originator of internal dissension. Hodson's conclusions, however, ought to be re-examined. The fact that Killigrew had delegated the artistic direction of the company to the three players who had had experience of not only performing in pre-Commonwealth theatres, but also had had experience managing theatrical activities, can hardly be regarded as failure on Killigrew's part. Moreover, the fact that Killigrew had to intervene and solve the problem caused by the triumvirate surely is a point in favour of Killigrew's competence. As for Clun's dead share, Killigrew only did what the triumvirate had done before, with the important distinction that the Lord Chamberlain was in favour of Killigrew's decision, on the grounds that he had the authority as patentee. It is worth pointing out that although Killigrew was well within his rights to keep the share, he instead voluntarily gave the share back to the company, unlike the triumvirate. Back at the Duke's company, Davenant's experimenting mounting new plays finally paid off when he produced Roger Boyle's play, The History of Henry V. The play was a hit, as it ran for 10 consecutive days, with its popularity derived partly from it being splendidly clothed, with costumes that had been worn in the royal coronation a few years before. Killigrew must have been devastated, as Charles II had just over a year before commissioned a different play of Boyle's, The General, to be staged by the King's Company. Had The General been staged promptly, it would have been the first rhymed heroic play ever performed. The General, produced approximately a month later by the King's Company, was less successful than its counterpart, as the play ran for exactly half the number of performances. Judith Millhouse has viewed this as an example of Killigrew's most flagrant foot-dragging. Yet Millhouse too hastily condemns Killigrew, as his decision not to mount Boyle's play most likely had a political dimension. During the Civil War, Boyle was a personal favourite of Cromwell, and had served protectorate as a member of the Cabinet Council until Cromwell's death in 1658, before quickly turning royalist. Written around 1661, The General overtly served as Boyle's means of excusing his misplaced loyalty during the war, as well as a way of ingratiating himself with the new regime. Killigrew, who was an unwavering royalist during the interregnum, must have had a hard time swallowing such a play, even if Charles II was all too ready to accept such a sycophant. It was only out of expediency, therefore, that Killigrew finally mounted The General to combat his rival's popular production. Nor was the failure of the play, as Millhouse implies, caused by Killigrew's delay. The primary reason for the failure of the play was due to the player's disappointing performance. The success of Davenant's Henry V clearly hinged on the Duke's three star players. In sharp contrast to Davenant's three leading players, the triumvirate of the King's Company were most likely still angry with Killigrew and unwilling to cooperate with him. After all, the King's Company's costumes surpassed those of the Duke's Company to such a degree that Pepys found the incongruity of bad performance and lavish pomp baffling, the play being so poorly acted, though in finer clothes, is strange. Despite his disgruntled triumvirate, however, Killigrew once again gained the upper hand over Davenant when he produced Richard Rhodes' Flora's Vagaries. Pepys applauded the play, especially with the most ingenious performance of the young Jade Flora. The actress who caught his eye was Nell Gwynn, who quickly became the King's Company's prima donna. Clearly threatened by the new actress in the King's Company, Davenant was quick to provide a suitable rival to Nell in Moll Davis. It is no coincidence that Downes, who gave a description of the Duke's production of The Rivals, focused on chiefly Celia, who was played by Moll Davis, who sang so charmingly that not long after it raised her to a royal bed. The competition between the actresses was beginning to heat up during this period, as can be seen in Killigrew's next production, James Howard's All Mistaken, when Nell sang an unmistakable parody of one of Moll's songs. Howard's play also importantly formed the basis for what was to be the new genre of the gay couple in Restoration drama, as the playwright clearly took advantage of the presence of both Charles Hart and Nell Gwynn in Killigrew's troupe. The public love interests and the stage personas of the two performers fueled the popularity of the genre. Killigrew played a major part in the development of the genre, as it is probable that he introduced Nell onto the stage. The Gwynn family first came into the notice of the Killigrews in 1663, when a Rose Gwynn, possibly Nell's sister, petitioned Henry Killigrew, Thomas Killigrew's son, to expedite her release from Newgate jail. The petition provides the crucial link with the King's Company, as it was not long afterwards that Nell started working for Thomas Killigrew. Killigrew's personal proclivities also directly affected the development of the drama of the time. In a spirit of one-upmanship over Davenant, he exploited the popularity of actresses by taking the sensational step of casting only women in his production of The Parson's Wedding on October 1664. Killigrew's view was that anything that breeds mirth is welcome, and his libertine inclination loomed large in his idea of mirth, as he has one of his characters say, "They are the prettiest kind of commodities, these women, there is nothing like 'em." Peter Llewellyn was evidently shocked when he informed Pepys What a bawdy loose play that is acted by nothing but women at the king's house. The diarist, to the contrary, was markedly pleased with how the bar was being raised by Killigrew, for he wrote, "I am glad of it." In the spring, the two companies clashed for the last time before the twin disasters of the Great Plague and the Great Fire of London. Both troupes mounted new productions of heroic plays. Killigrew mounted Dryden's The Indian Emperor, and Davenant followed with Boyle's Mustapha. As the title indicates, Dryden's play was a sequel to The Indian Queen. The play thus opportunistically recovered some of the money spent on costumes and scenery, as the prologue engagingly admitted, "The scenes are old, the habits are the same, we wore last year." Yet not everything was sparingly done. On 16th of March 1665, new Indian gowns were specifically ordered by Killigrew to be made for the violinists. Killigrew had good reason for focusing his attention to the musicians, as it had been only 3 months before, in December, that he had been granted permission by Charles II to have the members of the royal music to attend whenever Killigrew shall desire them. Indeed, John Bannister, the director of the royal music, had been heavily involved in theatrical music ever since Killigrew had first introduced England the placing of musicians in front of the stage. As for Davenant's production, accounts vary as to the success of the play. Downes, in his customary manner, praised the Duke's production. Pepys, on the other hand, was not contented with it at all, and was more pleased with the fact that pretty witty Nelly at the King's house and the younger Marshal sat next to us. The stage rivalry, however, was terminated when the bubonic plague forced both theatres to close for 18 months. Killigrew began renovating his theatre during the hiatus, for on 19th of March 1666, Pepys walked to the King's Playhouse and found it all in dirt, they being altering of the stage to make it wider. Yet it was still uncertain if and when theatrical activities would resume in London, as Pepys wrote, "God knows when they will begin to act again." Indeed, God had more to do with it than perhaps Pepys fully realised, as the church in particular was against the stage reopening. The managers, however, finally prevailed to have liberty to act at both houses, with the proviso that they dispose a large share of their profit to charitable uses. Theatrical evidence strongly suggests that Davenant's troupes struggled to get back up on its feet immediately after the disaster. Etheridge's revival of the comical Revenge in October 1666 was a silly play, and having neither Betterton nor his wife, Pepys found the whole thing done ill and no manner of pleasure in the play. Another of the Duke's production was indifferently done. In the new production of Henry V, the audience had to wait for above an hour for the players. The Duke's players also suffered from lack of discipline. On September 1667, Pepys went to see the Duke's production of Mustapha, but found Betterton and Harris could not contain from laughing in the midst of a most serious part. In the following production, Pepys was furious, for they so spoiled it with their laughing, so much so that he resolved not to come hither again a good while. In contrast to the Duke's actors, Killigrew's troupe impressed the London theatregoers, as actresses gained even greater celebrity and prominence. On December 1666, Pepys saw The Maid's Tragedy by Fletcher, the first play I have seen in either house since before the plague, and thought it well acted, especially by the younger Marshal. Within the same month, he was back again in the King's Theatre to see both James Howard's The English Monsieur and The Scornful Lady. Of the former, he thought the women do very well, but above all, little Nelly, and of the latter, he was pleased with Mrs. Corey, who acted most excellently, and by Knepp, who played her part very well. He was pleased overall with the King's House, more than I ever expected, due to the women doing better than I ever expected, and very fine women. One indication of the rising popularity of the King's companies actresses occurred when Rebecca Marshall lodged a complaint against Sir Hugh Middleton to the Lord Chamberlain. The Knight of the Realm, rejected by the actress, hired an agent who threw a turd upon her face and hair. While critics such as J. H. Wilson and Elizabeth Howe have seen this anecdote as an example of the vulnerability of actresses during the Restoration period, it is possible to interpret Marshall's actions as indicative of the newly empowered status of actresses. She had, after all, boasted that she had a gracious promise from His Majesty that she should not be injured. Song and dance became a major focus of competition after 1666. The King's Company excelled in divertisement as Killigrew made use of his popular actresses. On February 1667, Killigrew produced Buckingham's Chances, wherein Knepp sang very properly and admirably. Pepys was once forced by the King's Company's actresses to stay in a box to see the dancing preparation for the next day's performance of The Goblin. In the production of The Black Prince, the King's Playhouse was infinitely full as the players impressed the audience with a very fine dance for variety of figures. The theatre-goers even came to admire the divertisement more than the plays. Nell Gwyn's part in Dryden's Secret Love demonstrated how playwrights were beholden to their actresses for their success. Of new praised poets, having often seen some of his fellows who have writ before, when Nell had danced to her jig, steal to the door, hear the pit clap, and with conceit of that, swell and believe themselves Lord knows what. The heated contest between the two companies, however, meant that the actresses soon need to do more. Cross-dressing became a major attraction during these years, as it usually offered the audience a titillating sight of actresses' legs. In March 1667, Killigrew produced Dryden's Maiden Queen, which so impressed Pepys that when Nell came in like a young gallant, that it made him admire her. Davenant replied within a week with John Carroll's The English Princess, wherein Pepys found nothing eminent in it, but with the crucial exception of Little Miss Davis, did dance a jig after the end of the play, and pleased the whole audience by dancing in boys' clothes. Foreign singers increasingly gained attention during the theatrical season of 1667 to 1668. From early on in the competition, Killigrew had plans to recruit foreign entertainers. When Pepys chanced to sit by the manager at the King's Playhouse in 1664, Killigrew told him that he intended to build a separate playhouse in Moorfields, where he would produce 4 operas in the year to act 6 weeks at a time, and to that end had sent for voices and painters and other persons from Italy. Insufficient funds, however, put a premature end to what Killigrew hoped would be an opera breeding facility where Italian singers would be the mainstay of the new company. Undeterred by financial hindrance, however, Killigrew told the same interlocutor on February 1667 of how he has gone several times, 8 or 10 times he tells me, hence to Rome to hear good music, that he has ever endeavoured in the late King's time and in this to introduce good music, but he never could do it, that he has gathered our Italians from several courts in Christendom to come to make a concert for the King, which he do give £200 a year apiece to, but badly paid and do come in the room of keeping 4 ridiculous gondolas, he having got the King to put them away and lay out money this way. And indeed, I do commend him for it, for I think it is a very noble undertaking. Pepys also recorded a petite musical by the Italian Signor Battista at the house of Lord Bruckner. During the evening, Battista did sing one of the acts, and that he had composed in Italian for the opera, which, as Pepys reported, Thomas Killigrew do intend to have up. Later they visited Mrs. Knepp's chamber, where this Italian is to teach her to sing her part, and there she did sing an Italian song or two very fine. Undoubtedly, Knepp's convincing imitation of singing in the Italian manner was partly why Killigrew decided to give her £30 a year more. On 16th of February, the diarist was back again in Lord Bruckner's house, where Killigrew brought a company of Italian musicians, that is to say, Signor Vincentio, who is the master composer, and 6 more, whereof 2 eunuchs, so tall that Sir T. Harvey said well that he believes they do grow large by being gelled as our oxen do. Killigrew was so in love with the abnormally tall eunuchs that he praised them to be the heavens as above all things in the world. Davenant clearly felt constrained to respond in kind to Killigrew's foreign entertainers. However, he adopted a nationalistic strategy that was less expensive and extravagant. While Killigrew not only employed foreign stars but also mounted plays set in distant lands with foreign protagonists such as the Indian Queen, the Indian Emperor, and Secret Love, Davenant clearly deviated from the King's Company's strategy by producing plays set in England with native heroes. The prologue to Henry V states, "We have with foreign tales so filled your ears as if our poets were all foreigners. This author begs you will lend 2 hours to entertain with your ancestors." The prologue to the Duke's production of The English Princess, again in contrast to the foreign sovereigns that its rival company dealt in, goes, "You must today your appetite prepare for a plain English treat of homely fare. We neither bisque nor liars shall advance from Spanish novel or from French romance, nor shall we charm your ears or feast your eyes with Turkey works or Indian rarities." Davenant's strategy was timely. In July 1667, Pepys implied that the theatres had been closed during June and early July due to aggravated naval encounters with the Dutch. With the decisive Dutch victory in the Second Anglo-Dutch War, the King's Company's reliance on foreign entertainment was suddenly not as fashionable. Pepys noted after seeing the King's production of Brenor Rout how the foreign tune did not impress him as much as a good English tune, the manner of their air not pleasing me so well as the fashion of our own. The King's Company quickly, albeit temporarily, retraced its steps, as it reprised all productions of English-themed plays, such as the Custom of the Country in August, and in the same month, The Country Captain, The Merry Wives of Windsor, and Queen Elizabeth's Troubles. The period also saw the transition of prologues and epilogues from mere pleas for a good reception of a dramatic piece to effective competitive devices employed by the two managers. While it has often been pointed out that the Restoration prologues and epilogues were tailored to the personality of the players, it has been seldom pointed out that they also reflected the managers' personalities, which in turn reflected company policy. Killigrew's fame as the King's jester and the unique privilege attached to the post no doubt influenced the company to cash in on his notoriety by employing abusive prologues. As the second prologue to the King's Company's production of Secret Love shows, the most compendious method is to rail, which you so like you think yourselves ill-used. When in smart prologues you are not abused, a civil prologue is approved by no man. You hate it as you do a civil woman. The popularity of abusive prologues influenced the King's Company to further escalate their tactic. On April 1667, Killigrew produced Edward Howe's The Change of Crowns, in which after the end of the play, John Lacey, Killigrew's chief comedian, came on stage and began abusing the court with all the imaginable wit and plainness about selling of places and doing everything for money. After the performance, Charles II was so angry with the liberty taken at the King's players to abuse him to his face that he commanded they should act no more. Killigrew's troupe had by this time clearly earned the infamous reputation of being the brazen troupe, much like the patentee himself, so that when the whole house was silenced sometime during April 1667, the gentry seemed to rejoice much at it, the house being become too insolent. The cutting blow, however, on the profligacy of Charles II and his court was obviously deeply felt, as the king immediately declared a new directive for economy in fashion for clothing. The king had yesterday, in council, declared his resolution of setting a fashion for clothes, which he will never alter. It will be a vest. It is to teach the nobility thrift. The king's sanctions against the house, however, did not discourage Killigrew's troupe from their newly found popular device. In Robert Howard's The Great Favourite, the epilogue reproached Charles II about his mistresses. The epilogue was so disrespectful that Pepys was troubled that it should be interrupted. But to his great relief, it ended all well. In an effort to counter the vogue for abusive prologues, the Duke's company began to use their prologues and epilogues to flatter their audience instead. Davenant made a quip against Killigrew's troupe in the epilogue to The Man's the Master. Since now those poets get the vogue who still, with a bold epilogue, dare rattle spectators and cry 'em down. First, loving kind friends who come from the city, you never think any play can be witty, but that in which courtiers shrewdly are jeered. It was clear that if Killigrew's policy was to jibe and insult his audience, Davenant's policy would be to please and flatter his theatre-goers instead. The prologue to William Cavendish's The Humorous Lovers went so far as to have the manager himself thank the audience. So William Davenant thanks you for his part and loves your company with all his heart. This prologue is only one of its type that alludes specifically to a company manager. This is an indication that the managers were personally responsible for how the company fashioned itself. In the Duke's company's case, it was to be servitude. The difference in company policy did not prevent the managers from attempting to subvert the other house's success, and the competition reached its final showdown between Killigrew and Davenant in 1668 as they fought over John Dryden. Killigrew was hoisted by his own petard as his most successful playwright. Dryden was lured by Davenant to collaborate on Sir Marshal Marall. The production was an immense success, as it got the company more money than preceding comedy. Pepys went to see the production 8 times, and he raved, "Never laughed so in all my life. I laughed till my head ached all the evening and night with laughing." On September 1667, Killigrew responded by producing Fletcher and Massinger's The Storm. The new production was so popular that the house was infinitely full, with the king and all the court almost there. The play ended with an admirable dance of the ladies in a military manner. Pepys was so enthralled that he had to take his wife from the Duke's playhouse to show her yesterday's new play. Davenant was obviously hurt by his rival's success, as on November 1667 he replied with The Tempest. The play was an enormous success, with the house mighty full, so that Pepys was forced to sit in the side balcony over against the music room at the Duke's house. Undoubtedly, to Killigrew's great chagrin, Davenant had again succeeded in getting Dryden to cooperate with him on the adaptation. To add insult to injury, the prologue of the play even openly jeered at the King's Company's production. The storm which vanished on the neighbouring shore was taught by Shakespeare's Tempest first to roar, that innocence and beauty which did smile in Fletcher grew on this enchanted isle. But Shakespeare's magic could not copied be, within that circle none durst walk but he. The antagonistic tone may well have been the result of Dryden's quarrel with his brother-in-law Sir Robert Howard, who was a major shareholder and playwright of the King's Company. Dryden's shift in allegiance may well have become permanent had not Killigrew made an offer he could not refuse. Dryden was offered a formal agreement whereby he would write 3 plays per annum in return for the proceeds from 1 1/4 shares of the company profit. This unprecedented manoeuvre is indicative of Killigrew's generosity as well as of his discernment of the value of Dryden. Davenant died shortly after having lost the tug-of-war with Killigrew over Dryden, thus concluding the theatrical competition between the two managers. Theatre historians have hitherto assumed that compared with his counterpart, Sir William Davenant, Thomas Killigrew was at best an absentee manager and at worst a fumbling nuisance. Touted as the father of English opera, Davenant is often credited with revolutionizing the English stage. Yet a close, comprehensive study of the competition between Davenant and Killigrew yields a different story. Indeed, the heated rivalry and the spirit of one-upmanship between the two theatre managers heavily influenced the types of plays produced. The direction of the theatrical representation in these years was towards spectacular costumes, music, and scenery. Therefore, it is unsurprising to find that the most popular genre in tragedy was the bombastic heroic type, with plays of Boyle and Dryden. For comedy, the introduction of marketable actresses by the theatre managers initiated the gay couple genre in Restoration drama. Killigrew was very influential in all these developments, as he initiated many of the changes in drama, both on and off the stage. This paper gives the lie to the stereotype of Killigrew as the manager who cherished the idea of a return to the old ways. He clearly challenged the status quo of theatrical entertainment by introducing the orchestra pit into English theatres, by devising revolutionary productions, and by quickly recruiting foreign stars. Furthermore, far from the conventional view of Killigrew as an absentee manager, this paper has shown that he was heavily involved in the productions of his company. He used his favours with the king to gain the necessary props for plays to succeed. He showed his managerial authority by quelling company disputes over dead shares, and was demonstrably active in hiring and retaining talented players and playwrights. Throughout the competition, we see Killigrew as a theatrical innovator and a tough competitor. Davenant, on the other hand, is in fact seen to be more reactive than innovative. He repeatedly retaliates against Killigrew's competitive devices and theatrical novelties. Thomas Killigrew, therefore, did not simply play second fiddle to Davenant, but was an influential theatrical impresario in his own right. Thank you for listening.